2,993 people, most of them in the World Trade Center. And that includes the hijackers that also were willing to sacrifice, kill themselves in the process. So just to remember what happened on that day, I think it's fitting that we should pause for a minute and in remembrance, in a minute of silence, in remembrance of the victims of that attack. So this coordinated operation that was organized, we believe, by the terrorist group Al-Qaeda is usually referred to as the 9/11 terrorist attack on the United States. And if you say 9/11, everyone knows what that means. But it was much more than an attack on the United States. It was really an assault on the world. Among those killed on that day were citizens of more than 90 nations, most of whom were working in the World Trade Center. And this fact really emphasizes the extent to which the world, by 2001, had become interconnected. And that interconnection hasn't diminished in the last 8 years. And globalization, which is the increasing integration of economies, culture, and communications around the world, is really the dominant international trend of our time. And we here in this ballroom this morning are an indication of the extent to which the world has become globalized. So at Eastern Michigan University this year, there are more than 1,000 international students, which is, I think, about 5% of our student body. And they have come from many nations of the world to study here. And these flags that we placed on the podium reflect some of that international representation that's right here on this campus. And we have faculty and staff from many countries speaking many different languages. And even those of us who were born in the United States and have been American citizens our entire lives, many of us speak other languages, have lived and worked in other languages, and are able to operate in other cultural contexts. And this has really become commonplace in the world in which we live. And we have to remind ourselves that 50 years ago, this was pretty rare. It was a relatively rare thing for people in countries who are natives of one country to live and work and learn the language of people in another country. And so the question that I'd like to consider for us today, in thinking about security issues, is what's the best means of ensuring security, not just of our nation, but for the globe. And so we'll define security, we'll talk about it more, and Professor Pearson and Professor Trumbore too will be talking about security. Security can be understood as protection from hostile action. How do we protect people and resources from the hostile actions of others? How can nations, either singly or jointly, best protect their citizens and resources from, for example, international terrorist groups, which are non-state organizations operating within and across several or many nations? So terrorist organizations, too, are part of the reality of globalization. Or how do states and nations protect themselves from more traditional threats, such as the potential of invasion or military attack by another state? How can we stop nuclear proliferation and respond effectively to other more kind of amorphous but still very important threats, such as climate change? How can we deal with humanitarian crises that threaten entire regions? So to get us thinking about this and to think about what sort of security strategy the United States can pursue, I think it's important to kind of review various concepts and understandings of security and how these are used by professionals, by people who study international relations, and also by those who are the practitioners of international relations, the state leaders and diplomats that forge foreign policy and make decisions for nations. And so what I'm going to talk a bit about, and this will lead into the presentations of my colleagues here, are changing conceptions of security, how our concepts of security have changed over time. And that's important because then we can think about, well, what notion of security are we operating within, and what kind of vision of security do we want to achieve? Now, the traditional approach to security is based on what we would call a realist understanding of the international order. And in this understanding of the world is composed of sovereign states that each have fixed borders and the right to control entirely what goes on within their territories. A second assumption of this vision of the world, the traditional approach to security, is that the international system, the world, is anarchic. There is no order or no permanent or lasting order between states. So there's constant competition between states for resources, for control over regions. States are constantly trying to expand their territory, expand their resources, usually at the expense of other states. So the realist vision of the world is a vision of the world in which states are locked in this very intense competition with one another, and that competition will almost always lead to war. So from a realist perspective, war is inevitable. It's going to occur. It's part of the nature of human beings, the nature of the world in which we live. And the only way that a state can enhance its security in that kind of a world is by enhancing its power, by building up its power. And that, the realist notion of power is a notion that emphasizes the military capabilities of states, the possession of significant military force that will deter attacks against it and will also allow it to influence the states around it. And so the assumption is that states will try to balance each other. So because they have to worry about other states gaining more power, they have to be constantly building up their resources and their power in order to forestall an attack. And the only kind of order that can be achieved in such a system arises through a balance of power. So states will balance one another in terms of the power capabilities that they have, and that may allow for some temporary peace, if you will, but it's certainly not a peace that will last from the realist understanding. It's a period of relative calm or lack of conflict. But that, any kind of balance of power or temporary peace is fraught with uncertainty and will not last, largely because of something that realists refer to, and anyone that studies international relations refers to, as the security dilemma. And the security dilemma is the problem that any state's attempt to enhance its own security inevitably poses a threat to the security of the states around it. So a state may not even have the intention of causing other states to want to attack it or fear it. But by acquiring more weapons, expanding its military forces, enhancing its technology, that state inevitably is entering into the security dilemma where other states look at it and say, this state's becoming a threat to us. And to think about the security dilemma, all we have to really think about is China today. So China is this rapidly rising power, and many states around the world increasingly see China as, if not a threat right now, then a potential threat. And so when you have a situation of rising powers in particular, that kind of destabilizes any kind of balance of power in the international system and creates the conditions under which some conflict is possible. Okay, so that's the traditional notion of security. And all of you are familiar with this notion of security because this is probably the notion that you're most familiar with, and it's the notion that really our government uses most often. And certainly the Bush administration worked with this notion of security for the last 8 years. And I think we see strong elements of it in the current administration as well, even though President Obama said that he wanted to chart a sort of new course of international relations. We'll get back to that, and we can save some of that for discussion as well. Okay, so in opposition to that notion of security, another notion of security emerged in the middle, or well, really from the beginning of the 20th century, but really developed fully in the middle of the 20th century, and it created the conditions for the creation of the establishment of the United Nations, and different ways of dealing with problems. And this is the notion of collective security. And collective security is the idea that the best way for states to achieve security is not to individually be trying to enhance their power, but for states to work together in order to prevent aggressors from destabilizing the international system and causing war. That notion of collective security was first institutionalized in the League of Nations following the First World War, And as you know, as you may know, the League of Nations was not successful ultimately because it was not able to prevent the rise of Nazi Germany and the war that was launched by Germany and its allies. And the League of Nations was formally dissolved at the end of the Second World War, but it really ceased to be an effective organization by the beginning of the Second World War. After the Second World War, which resulted in approximately 100 million deaths around the world, so the Second World War, 100 million people died in that period. Again, the world said, we can't let war happen again. We have to create an even stronger version of collective security. We have to create an institution that will allow us to have some kind of permanent peace, a new kind of world order. And the United States led the way in that process of the creation of a new type of international security system, and it was embodied in the United Nations. And that security system still exists today. So in terms of the nature of the international system, you have some states that are still behaving as if that traditional security system still works, and they occasionally resort to it. But there really is, in international law and in institutions, a collective security system that has been created. Now we can talk maybe a little bit more about why collective security often fails and doesn't work very effectively. And that has to do with the architecture of the United Nations, the role of the Security Council, and then the role of great powers like the United States and other great powers in not being willing to work through the Security Council. But the thing here to emphasize is that the United States was a leader in the creation of this institution and in collective security. And obviously there are problems with collective security. A kind of a revision of the collective security notion developed in the last, I'd say last 20 or 25 years of the 20th century, from the 1970s and 1980s, and it's still an idea that is important in discussions about security today. And this is the idea of common security or mutual security. And the idea of common security, it doesn't really so much supplant or replace the concept of collective security as it adds to it, it widens it. It kind of expands the notion of what states can do when they collaborate with one another, what they should do when they collaborate with one another. I study Russian politics, and so I like to emphasize the fact that Mikhail Gorbachev played a pretty important role in raising this whole concept of collective security, or common security, to people's consciousness, and making it almost possible for a while. It almost seemed like it was going to happen. And Gorbachev, if you remember, in 1988, those of you who were around in 1988, Gorbachev laid out an idea called New Political Thinking for the world. And this was the idea that the great powers, the superpowers, had to stop competing with one another. They had to stop playing this game of nuclear brinksmanship and trying to carve up the world between one another, because they had put the world in a position of incredible risk, where it would not only be possible that there would be war, but that there would be a war that would destroy civilization and would potentially even destroy humanity. That the superpowers had enough weapons that if they unleashed them in a war, it would destroy every living thing on the planet. And this is what he really emphasized. He said, we live in a period of history where all of our security is interconnected. The United States cannot be a secure country if other countries in the world are insecure. Or the Soviet Union cannot be a secure country if these threats to human existence and to civilization continue. And these threats were not just the threat of nuclear annihilation or the use of chemical and biological weapons, in his view, but also increasingly the probability that we were destroying our own environment. And that at some point, if we continued in this way, we would make human life impossible on the planet and increasingly difficult, and that would be a threat to the security of people all over the globe. Gorbachev was a visionary. You could see these things happening, even in 1988. And so in this speech in the UN in December of 1988, he announced drastic cuts in the Soviet military presence in Eastern Europe and along the Chinese border, and really kind of unilateral pulling out of the Cold War. It was pretty much the Soviet Union said, we're not going to fight the Cold War anymore. We're not going to do this. This doesn't make sense anymore. And he called for dramatic reductions in armaments, and there were some real breakthroughs in that period in reduction of tensions. And of course, we know the Soviet Union collapsed. There was this time in the late 1980s and the early 1990s when it seemed as if this kind of this notion of common or mutual security would become the kind of dominant approach. So under a notion of common or mutual security, what states have to do is work together to address and eliminate the threats to humanity. And this includes attending to the problem of weapons of mass destruction, attending to the problem of environmental degradation, working together to eliminate poverty in the world, and attacking diseases as well. So that notion of mutual security is still a pretty radical notion in many ways. And we certainly haven't achieved it. It's certainly, I would argue, not the one that we're working with today in the contemporary world. And it's not the kind of guiding principle of American foreign policy, or it hasn't been for some time. A related notion to common or mutual security is human security. And this is the idea that it's not states that are the primary actors in the international system, but human beings, individual human beings. And that the only thing that states should be doing, and the highest end of states, is to deliver human well-being. That's what international politics should be all about. The states need to give up this whole idea of expanding their power relative to one another and focus instead on human security. And only when humans are secure around the planet and their basic needs and their rights as human beings are protected, can there be true peace in the world. That's the foundation for peace in the world. And so you can see that the idea of human security is a really radical idea. And if this idea of security was implemented or accepted by states, that we would see a very different kind of international system. Okay, so I'm talking on too long here, and I don't want to use up all the time. But what I want to end with is just a couple of questions for you to think about. So what is the national security approach that's being taken by the Obama administration right now? Where's Obama in these different conceptions of security? And you may recall last spring there was this debate between President Obama and Dick Cheney about how the United States can best enhance its security in the world. And Dick Cheney vigorously defended the strategy of unilateralism and the global war on terror that had been articulated by the Bush administration. And that's the traditional notion of security that I talked about at the beginning here. That's the one that the Bush administration was working with. And Obama really sort of in this debate was taking a centrist approach between a kind of unilateral, aggressive military response to terrorist threats and this idea that there needs to be dialogue between civilizations and between peoples and more cooperation between nations. So he's moving more in the direction, I would say, to common security. But at the same time, what he's done is he's shifted our military presence from Iraq to Afghanistan. And the global war on terror is just being moved from one theater to another. And the techniques that were used in Iraq and the basic approaches are largely those that are now being used in Afghanistan. So that might be a question that my two colleagues would sort of think about in their talks, or they may address and that we can talk about as well, is how effective is that approach to addressing the threat of terrorism. So what would a foreign policy that emphasized common security or human security look like? And how might the United States have a different type of presence in Afghanistan if it followed that conception of international security? Okay, thank you. I'm also the moderator out here, so I have to remember my role. And our next speaker is Professor Fred Pearson. Professor Pearson is a professor of political science at Wayne State University, a very distinguished scholar on the topic of international conflict, and he also directs a new program on peace and peace and security. So, without further ado, I introduce.
And I'll leave some material on this new Master's Certificate in Peace and Security Studies, which we're presenting from our Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, which is available to any of the students here, by the way, who are taking master's programs and might want to add a certificate to that, or who might want to come to Wayne for some graduate work in general, which we always like to see. Right? It's interesting that in the commemoration of September 11th, we have not been attacked again, thank goodness, directly here in the United States. And one wonders why that is. Is it because of a strong, forceful response to terrorism? Or is it a circumstance where it's been just too costly or less costly to attack elsewhere, because there have been acts of terror since 9/11. Is there something in the offing? I'm reminded of the Cold War analogy of the guy who was waving his arms frantically along the Mississippi River, and somebody came up to him and said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm keeping the alligators away," in St. Louis. And somebody said, "Well, there aren't any alligators within 1,000 miles of here." And he said, "See, I'm doing quite a good job." Right? So you never know why something doesn't happen. And the subject of Afghanistan has been brought up, and I think that the difficulties, there is a war going on, by the way. Sometimes we're oblivious to that, and given our difficulties in domestic affairs right now, the definite concern about the economy and healthcare, which are crucial, by the way, crucial aspects of security. People are very insecure right now throughout the United States, and in this region particularly, in their lives. But we then sometimes forget that there is a set of wars, there are two actually, at least two, one being in Iraq, the other in Afghanistan. They're still going on. By the way, the cost of those is well over the 10-year projected cost of a healthcare program in the United States. The projected cost of a trillion and a half, perhaps, over 10 years, has already been exceeded by the Iraq War. So it's a question for us to think about what we want to pay for. What kind of security do we want to pay for, and how do you get it? And the recent developments in Afghanistan on the heels of the Iraq War have highlighted, I think, a reasonable set of questions about the limitations of what might be called the use of hard power in world affairs. We talk about power, and that is an aspect of security policy, the use of power. But power is a multidimensional concept. And one of the prime scholars in our midst in the United States, Joseph Nye, since 1990, has highlighted for us the important trade-offs of how do you use power? What is power? And he has isolated two main concepts, one being the notion of hard power, which is the familiar one attached a lot often to realism, the use of coercion, and he would also say payments. You get power through coercion. You don't mess around with rogues, you do something about them, and you force them to stop. The other conception is what might be called soft power, an often underappreciated element of power, I would say, and particularly so in the United States foreign policy tradition. We have it in abundance, this so-called soft power. What is soft power? Soft power for Nye is what you might call attraction. The power of attraction. What does that mean? Well, in an article just this last month in Foreign Affairs, he has identified this. The major elements of a country's soft power include its culture, when it is pleasing to others, its values, when they are attractive and consistently practiced, and its policies, when they are seen as inclusive and legitimate. So, how does that give you power? Well, power is something we think we apply, but soft power is a sort of an attractiveness. And both elements have been present in the United States foreign policy throughout the years. Nye points out that the Cold War alliances, where people signed up for NATO, CETO, CENTO, and other pacts with the United States, depended partly on military power, but partly on the sense that there were common interests. And that there was a trust factor, and that the United States was basically often on the right side of questions that others could agree with. There was also the whole economic structure that the U.S. really set up after the Second World War, called the Bretton Woods system, which had to do with free trade, it had to do with the IMF, it had to do with the World Bank. It had to do with institutions that people could buy into and be attracted to for various reasons. Since come under some fire, but they're still present in organizations like the World Trade Organization and other elements of the economic regime, as you might want to put it. What Nye ends up arguing for is that both of these kinds of power are necessary and useful, but he argues for something called smart power. The application of power in combinations that make sense, that are not senseless. And what I would argue about recent American policies, and when I say recent, I mean going all the way back, by the way, to Jimmy Carter, is that sometimes we have nonsense going in our applications of power. It's not just been George W. Bush, and I would argue he's one of the main persons committing not smart power, unsmart, whatever, dumb power. Should we say it in those terms? I mean, the Iraq War was a destabilizing, senseless application of power. The Afghanistan problem has shown, by the way, a direct response of 9/11, the attempt to go after the source of terror, which we identified as having arisen in Afghanistan, has identified difficulties in the application of power. The more you seem to apply military power, the more alienated the local population becomes. Yet they look to you for some sort of liberation from other oppressors, more local oppressors. And so the Army now has taken up doctrines of applying state building and nation building and aid programs to go along with the application of power. The problem is every bombing that kills innocent people undermines the so-called winning of hearts and minds. This is not the first time this problem emerged. Vietnam is a key historical incident which should stand out for us still, in which the United States, for all of its massive military and material power, could not bring to heel a small, undeveloped country and rebuild it in the image we were trying to build. I'm reminded of the statement by the noted journalist of the time, leftist journalist, critical journalist, I.F. Stone, American journalist, who had a very famous line: "How do you win a peasant war on the side of the landlords? How do you win a peasant war in a society on the side of the landlords?" This raises the question of smart power. How do you swim upstream with military force if the politics of the situation are unsuited to the application of force? Or at least the unsuited to the application of the kind of force you're trying to administer? Are you on the right side of history? Are you swimming upstream and trying to stop events that really have a momentum, a historical momentum? Iraq was a highly anti-colonial country, one of the first in the Middle East, to expel foreign colonial powers, the British, and behead the king, who was the British instrument in Iraq in 1958. Incredibly, Britain comes back with the United States to refight a war in a country that had already liberated itself from outside occupation. Britain was willing to do that. And by the way, it shows the attraction of American soft power, that Britain was willing to do what Prime Minister Blair said, pay a blood price to keep our relationship with the United States. Against all of our interests, against our public opinion, they nevertheless went ahead with us. The United States has frittered away numerous situations where soft power was giving us advantages. I mentioned Carter. Carter had the world on his side when the U.S. diplomats were kidnapped by Iran the Iranian revolutionaries in 1979. The world was basically in favor of the principle that you don't kidnap diplomats. You don't even give them parking tickets in New York. I mean, there's a reason for that. You don't kill the messengers, okay? Everybody subscribes to that. The Soviet Union subscribed to that and was willing to give us help in trying to bring the diplomats home. The only problem was that the Soviet Union also embarked on an intervention in Afghanistan in 1979. And Carter, misplacing his priorities, decided that it was in the U.S. interest, security interest, to oppose the Soviet effort to maintain its hold in Afghanistan. That immediately created a parting of the ways between the United States and the Soviet Union over not only the 1980 Olympics, but over the question of the diplomats, hostages in Tehran. And this is the kind of unappreciation of soft power where you have world consensus behind you, and because of a decision to apply coercive power, misguidedly, perhaps at that moment, mistimed, and I think, by the way, again, on the wrong side of history, President Reagan followed it up in an even bigger way, giving more aid to the anti-Soviet mujahideen elements in Afghanistan, resulting ultimately, yes, and we could argue, in the expulsion of the Soviet Union, but also in the rise of one Osama bin Laden, who was given direct support and assistance by the United States government. Oh, what interesting things we reap when once we practice hard power blindly. And the question then is, how do you create better appreciation of these trade-offs and the necessity to consider soft power? In the case of Afghanistan today, we are following much, and it's been called having the potential for Obama's Vietnam. Following a policy of deeper and deeper involvement in order to oppose a side that once ruled the country, the Taliban, that's once won a civil war inside that society, for better or worse. Its opponents, the Northern Alliance, as we came to call them, opponents, were fractured and themselves destructive and corrupt. Yet those are the sides that we back to oppose the Taliban and go after bin Laden, supposedly. Neither goal has been effectively achieved, and there's no sign that it's in the offing that we will achieve the goal of restabilizing Afghanistan, at least with the incursion of military force and the difficulty that hard power confounds soft power. The United States has lost a good deal of standing in the world because of our general Middle East policy. Policy generally throughout the years under many presidents had been a relatively strong effort to keep an even-handed policy in the Middle East. Everyone knows the United States is pro-Israeli. There's no secret about that. Committed to Israel. There's even an alliance between the United States and Israel. The Arabs are aware of that. But what they didn't expect was what they got from the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, is a completely uncritical blank check policy for Israeli support. In tune with the Iraq invasion, in an attempt evidently to remake the Middle East in some sort of proto-democratic Western image, to do away with rogues and uncooperative states and coerce an outcome that would be, they thought, attractive, by the way. They thought ultimately it would be attractive that once democracy was installed in Iraq, everybody would follow suit, and they'd all make peace with Israel because our colleague, Dr. Kullberg, knows that there's a very strong theory at work in political science right now called the democratic peace theory, which is that if everybody's democratic, they don't fight each other. So that actually, I think, was an attempt to apply that notion in the Middle East coercively to force change, to force democracy on people for their own good in the long term. Because in the long term, then everyone would be attracted to peace. So we have these unsubstantiated premises that keep reappearing in American policy where we fail to appreciate, I think, the potential for backing off and adopting less coercive strategies when they don't work. We're all worried about the credibility problem. We were worried in Vietnam. If we pulled out of Vietnam, our credibility would go down. We're now worried if we pull out of Afghanistan, our credibility, we lose. What will that mean to the opponents, to the radicals, when they see the United States has been backed out of Afghanistan? Well, I would argue that credibility is related to trust. And trust comes from being on a footing with people where they can feel that their interests and their priorities are heard. That you're really listening to them and reacting to their needs. Not simply your own ideas of what has to happen. Unilateral or even multilateral. I mean, we have a coalition of the willing in Iraq. What did that mean? Well, they were willing to do what we wanted to do. That's different from a coalition of the supportive, of the people who really do buy into the policy. We have neighbors, we have allies who caution us about things, ranging from the British, who now don't want to participate further in either war, and the Europeans, to the Canadians and others who have played constructive roles in peacekeeping and in even fighting in Afghanistan. They too have qualms about what's going on. Are we listening? Are we paying heed? The bigger coalitions are what we rely on. These are the coalitions that supply us information for intelligence. The world's worst terrorist in our modern time was Carlos the Jackal, a European, actually South American, radical revolutionary of the 1970s. He was caught through an international intelligence cooperation between the United States and France and others. That's the kind of action that actually does stop terrorism. It's not the military forces that generally stop terrorist groups. It is the information sources. It is the semi-police approach to terrorism as a crime problem, where you find out where they're going, who's going there, and when you can get there and capture them. These kinds of things require trust, they require cooperation, they require people not alienate each other, as we did with the Russians when the Iran hostages were taken. So these are some ideas that I wanted to present to you. I just have been working on a book on how do you solve civil wars. We saw a recent civil war in Sri Lanka seemingly end by military victory, but more and more civil wars seem to be ending by cooperative negotiation. And one key factor in that is outside intervention in a positive vein. Security guarantees from international organizations, restructuring economies through international aid programs, disarmament through joint peacekeeping forces. These are not foolproof, but they're the main elements we political scientists have been able to identify in a trend toward a greater number of settlements and civil wars through negotiation. So there are some positive signs out there if we pay attention to them, and I think Nye points to some reasons why we should pay attention more to soft power alternatives. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I'm Pete Trumbore, Professor of Political Science at Oakland University. I want to thank Judy for inviting me out and thank Eastern Michigan for sponsoring this today. And I want to tell you that one of the hallmarks of a good conference is when the audience outnumbers the panelists. So you guys, by coming out this morning, you've knocked this one out of the ballpark, so thank you for being here today. What I want to talk to you about is something that relates to what both Judy and Fred have been talking about already, but also will help tie into the session that's going to follow this one that's going to focus on human rights. I'm going to talk to you today about the connection between violent norms and violent behavior. In short, the connection between human rights and international conflict. And there are a couple of reasons why I want to cover that. First of all, when Judy was talking about the different sorts of conceptions of security, I think that we can begin to think of them as mutually exclusive, that one definition of security precludes the adoption or the consideration of other conceptions of security. And one of the things that I want to try to get at in the remarks I'm going to make this morning is the extent to which some of these conceptions of security may in fact inform each other in surprising ways. And as I sort of get through my remarks, I'm going to want you to think about some of the issues that Fred was just discussing. The question of power and how does one accomplish one's foreign policy goals. Because the question that I want to leave you with after I finish talking about the research that I've been doing over the last several years is the what do we do about it question. Recognizing that the pattern that I'm going to describe for you is apparently a real pattern. What then should be the appropriate policy response to the pattern that I'm going to talk about? Now, if we start thinking about the issue of human rights and the connection between human rights and conceptions of international security, one of the things we have to confront right at the very beginning is that traditionally and historically, policy practitioners have doubted the relevance of human rights for national security. It's that there is this gap between human rights and what it means, the extent to which the realization or support for or compliance with international human rights norms is really meaningful from a security standpoint. Because what you typically get from a sort of a realist foreign policy approach is an argument which says, we cannot devote the time or the energy to something so peripheral as promoting human rights. It might be a shame what's happening to those poor people someplace else, but the bottom line is, it is a dangerous distraction. And in the interests of securing ourselves and securing our own territorial boundaries, our own policy parties, whatever, we cannot go out of our way to think about doing anything about somebody else's human rights problems. What I want to do is try to sort of get you to think about why we need to narrow that gap between caring about human rights and thinking about how human rights affects international security. So that's where I'm going to try to go. And I'll try to do that relatively quickly so we can get to your guys' comments and questions. One of the things this gets us to think about is that relationship between domestic political and social norms and values and the behavior that states engage in their international politics. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a conception began to emerge in U.S. foreign policy circles, this idea of rogue states. And there are all kinds of problems with the way that American foreign policymakers define rogue states in this period. But the intuitive logic behind rogue states is a useful one. What it says is that there are norms of behavior in the international system, that those norms of behavior should be followed, and that when states violate these central norms of behavior, it both destabilizes the international system and creates conflict. So that in and of itself is a really useful concept. Now the problem with the rogue state idea is that the norms of behavior they focused on are not ones that really are all that important. It's not that they're not important, they're not the ones that really count when trying to figure out just how dangerous some of these countries are. The useful part, though, again, is to get us to look at that connection between norms and behavior and think about how violations of accepted international norms affect questions of international stability and international security. This is something, that question of the link between norms domestically and behavior internationally is one that started to get looked at in some detail in the 1960s when scholars began to try to understand whether or not democracies were really different from other types of governments. There was an effort made in the early 1960s, well, late 1960s actually, to try to demonstrate that democracies were in fact more peaceful than other types of governments, other types of regimes. And while this research really failed to show that in a really compelling way, it did lay the groundwork for thinking about that relationship between internal norms and external behavior. And then later on, it becomes the sort of the centerpiece of the normative explanation for the democratic peace phenomenon, which essentially holds, right, that democracies don't go to war with each other. Now, they do go to war with non-democracies, and that's a problem. But the logic of the democratic peace is that if we all become democracies, if all states become democratic, war becomes a thing of the past. There's some reason to be skeptical about that kind of prescription, but there you have it, right? It's this idea that domestic norms, if they are benign in nature, can have a pacifying effect on external foreign policy. Okay, but think about this, right? If internal norms get externalized, what happens if your internal norms are norms of violence? What happens if your internal norms are malignant? Do those norms get externalized as well? And the results of the research that a colleague and I did over about a 4-year period demonstrates that that does in fact occur. What we wanted to look at is whether states that systematically violate international human rights norms in their domestic behavior also evidence problematic behaviors in their international conduct. In other words, are persistent human rights violators more dangerous internationally? We get at that question by going beyond traditional conceptions of security. We get at it from looking at the work of Johan Galtung, who talked about structural violence, right? This idea that we need to think about inequality and injustice as a form of violence. That violence is not just a physical act, but is a more sort of a structural dynamic, a structural condition of a society. But we're also informed by feminist critique of traditional international security scholarship and international security conceptions. This idea that says it's all about the state, and if the state is secure, you have security. What the feminist critique told us is that an individual of members of society are not secure. There is no security. Okay, but how do you convince a foreign policy practitioner of that? We sought to do it by demonstrating that states that are persistent human rights violators are also pretty bad internationally. And so that's what we did. What we did is we looked at 22 years of human rights data and international conflict behavior data to look and see if there were identifiable causal patterns between systematic human rights abuse and international conflict. And what we found is that states that stray the farthest from the accepted norms of international human rights, the norms that are enshrined in the so-called Universal Declaration model, right? The norms that we see in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the norms that are laid out in the 2 international covenants on human rights. That the further you are from respecting and realizing those norms and values in your domestic society, the more likely you are to become involved in a military dispute, to use violence within that dispute, in other words, to start shooting, and the more likely your state is to be the first state to fire the first shot in a military dispute. Now that's a useful thing to be aware of, right? Because I suspect that many of you in this room have found yourselves in a dispute with another individual, right? Talking, jawing, staring each other down. It's not a fight until someone throws that first punch. Persistent human rights abusers, systematic abusers of human rights, are more likely, considerably more likely, to throw that first punch when they find themselves involved in an international dispute. So I think what this points out to us is that human rights violation is not simply a problem of domestic political failure. It's not simply a problem for the people that live in a state that abuses their human rights. It is, in fact, a problem for the entire international system because human rights abusers destabilize the system and represent real security threats to their neighbors and to other members of the system. There are some other indications here that we should think about as well. They are not just conventional security threats. The research that we did also shows us that persistent human rights violators are far more likely to be formal state sponsors of international terrorist groups than are states in which human rights norms are respected. Human rights abusers are also once you control for things like technological capability, are also more likely to illicitly pursue the development of weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological